Sarah stood in the narrow aisle of the airplane. The hum of the engines and the occasional chatter of passengers filled the air, but something felt different today. The weight of the moment was pressing on her as her eyes scanned the floor. Between the seats, a glint of something caught her attention, something small and golden, wedged tightly between the cushions. She bent down, thinking it was just another lost coin or a forgotten pen. But as her fingers brushed against it, she froze. It wasn't a coin or pen. It was a ring, an old gold ring. She could tell by the way it shimmered under the overhead lights that it had been there for a long time, long enough to gather dust and neglect. Sarah slowly picked it up, the metal warm to the touch, as if it had been waiting for someone to find it. She turned it in her hand. The ring felt heavier than she expected, as if it carried a history more significant than she could understand, a piece of someone's life lost to time. She gazed at the ring for a moment, wondering how it had ended up here, and who it belonged to. Something about it felt wrong, not in a sinister way, but in a way that tugged at her curiosity. She couldn't shake the feeling that this ring had a story to tell, a story that was far from over. Sarah tucked the ring into her pocket and continued with her duties, but her mind kept drifting back to it. Every time she passed the seat where she'd found it, she couldn't help but wonder who had lost it. And why hadn't anyone noticed it was gone? She couldn't help herself. The mystery gnawed at her. The rest of the flight passed in a blur as Sarah kept going through the motions. She was used to the routine, the safety checks, the meal service. But today it was different. There was an undercurrent of tension inside her, a quiet storm that told her to figure out what this ring meant and why it had been left behind for so long. When the flight finally landed in London, Sarah's colleagues joked and laughed as they disembarked, but Sarah lingered behind her hand, still in her pocket, feeling the cool weight of the ring pressing against her skin. She wasn't ready to let go of it, not yet. After all, it wasn't just some forgotten trinket. It was something more, something deeper. Sarah's curiosity was eating at her, but it wasn't just curiosity. It was something else, something personal. She had seen lost things before, items left behind by passengers, but never had she felt this pull to return one. It was as if the ring had found its way into her hands for a reason, as if it was meant for her to find it and figure out its story. But the question was how. Where would she even begin to find out who it belonged to? She walked through the terminal, still holding the ring tightly in her palm, the shiny surface reflecting the overhead lights. As she thought about the possibilities, who would be missing a ring like this? Who would have left it behind? After all these years, was it truly lost, or had it been forgotten on purpose? The more Sarah thought about it, the more she realized the ring wasn't just a forgotten piece of jewelry. It was the key to a mystery, something larger than she could have imagined, something that might change everything for her if she could only uncover the truth. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The ring was burning a hole in her mind. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts racing back to the moment. She found it, the image of it nestled between the seats, still clear in her mind. Why had it felt so important? Why had it felt like it was meant for her to find? She tossed and turned, and finally decided she couldn't wait any longer. She had to know more about this ring, about the person it belonged to. She had never been one to give in to her curiosity so easily, but something about this felt different. It felt like destiny. She grabbed the ring from her bag and examined it closely in the dim light of her apartment. The engraving was faint, but there was something there, something she could barely make out at first glance. It looked like initials, WJ, and a date. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But there was something about those initials that nagged at her. It felt familiar, almost as if she had heard that name before, or maybe it was just the way the letters seemed to stare back at her. She ran her finger over the engraving again, tracing the curves of the letters. She felt a strange connection to it, like the ring was speaking to her, telling her that the story behind it was far from over. But where could she start? How could she find out more? She couldn't stop thinking about it. She had to know who this WJ was, and why they had left the ring behind. She spent the next few days researching the initials WJ and any possible connection to the date on the ring. but found nothing. Everything she looked into seemed like a dead end. The mystery deepened, and her obsession grew. She couldn't stop thinking about it. Who was this person? What had happened to them? And why hadn't anyone come forward to claim the ring? She felt like the answer was just out of reach. And the more she tried to uncover it, the more it seemed to slip through her fingers. She began to question everything. Was it even possible to find out who the ring belonged to after all this time? After all these years, was it worth it to keep searching, to keep digging? Or was she chasing a ghost? But deep down she knew she couldn't let go, not now. Not when something inside her told her that this ring was tied to a larger story, something that had been left unfinished, something that needed to be put to rest. She couldn't shake the feeling that the owner of this ring was out there somewhere, still waiting for it to be returned, like a piece of their soul had been left behind. When it was lost, she couldn't let it go. And so Sarah continued her search, scouring old records and newspaper articles, trying to find any connection between WJ and the date. She had uncovered nothing, but as the days passed, her mind kept going back to the same thought. What if this was more than just a ring? What if it was a sign, a clue that was meant to lead her to something important, something bigger than just a lost piece of jewelry? And so with that thought in her mind, she kept going. She couldn't stop now. Even if the mystery seemed impossible to solve, even if it felt like she was chasing shadows, she had to know who the ring belonged to and what had happened to the person it was meant for. Days turned into weeks, and still Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the ring, the way it glinted in the light, the way it seemed to call out to her, like it was meant for her to find it. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about it every waking moment. Her thoughts kept returning to those initials, WJ, and the faint date that had nearly faded into oblivion. She felt like she was on the edge of something big, but every time she reached for it, it slipped further away. She had spent hours in libraries, going through old records, searching through dusty archives for any clue that could explain the significance of the ring. But the more she searched, the more the mystery deepened. And still no answers. Her obsession was beginning to take over. She found herself looking for any hint of WJ in every conversation. She overheard any small detail that might lead her closer to the truth. It was as if the universe was teasing her. Every time she thought she had a breakthrough, it turned out to be a dead end. Still, she pressed on. Something inside her told her she couldn't stop, not yet, not when she was so close. But what if she was wrong? What if the ring didn't belong to anyone anymore? What if it was just a piece of forgotten history? But the thought of giving up made her feel like she was abandoning something important, something that needed to be found, something that belonged to someone who needed to be remembered. She remembered a small detail from the flight. When she had first found the ring, there had been a man and a woman sitting in the row near where the ring had fallen. She had overheard bits of their conversation, laughing quietly to themselves about their honeymoon plans. The memory stayed with her. But it wasn't until now that she thought it might be connected to the ring. What if this couple had something to do with the ring? What if the initials WG were tied to one of them? But how could she find them after all these years, with no way of knowing who they were, or even if they were still alive? But Sarah couldn't let go. She had to know the truth. She'd reached out to the airline archives once more, this time with a new question in mind. She asked if they had any record of a couple flying on the same flight in 1952, the year on the ring. But when she got the call back, her heart sank. The records were incomplete. There were gaps, too many to be sure. But one name stood out: Margaret James. The name sounded familiar, like a whisper in her memory, like it was something she should have known. But she couldn't place it at first. The name didn't ring any bells. But as Sarah dug deeper, she uncovered a tragic story. Margaret James had been traveling with her husband, William James, in 1952. When tragedy struck, William had died suddenly during the flight. Margaret had been left alone, a widow in the air, a widow who never saw her husband again, a widow who had never come forward to claim the ring. The ring Sarah had found, the weight of it hit Sarah like a wave. This wasn't just any ring. This was a piece of someone's heart, someone's life, someone's love lost to time. And now Sarah knew she had to return it. She had to find Margaret James and give her back the one thing that had been taken from her, the one thing that could bring her closure. Sarah couldn't stop the whirlwind of thoughts racing through her mind as she sat in her small apartment, staring at the incomplete records from the airline. The name Margaret James echoed in her head over and over again. Who was she? How had she survived the loss of her husband? On that fateful flight, what had happened to her after the tragedy? Sarah had to know more. It wasn't just about returning the ring anymore. It was about understanding the grief, the pain, the life that had been torn apart all those years ago. Sarah knew she needed to find Margaret James. But where could she possibly start? How could she track down someone who had been lost to time, a name with no real? Leads a widow who had vanished after a tragic accident. Sarah reached out to local newspapers, hoping to find something, some article or obituary that could shed light on Margaret's life. She spent hours digging through archives, reading old stories and articles about plane crashes from 1952. But nothing mentioned Margaret James, nothing about her life after the crash, just a note about William James's death and how the flight had been rerouted to the nearest airport in emergency response. But no mention of what happened to his wife. Sarah's heart sank with each dead end. She encountered it, felt like the universe was deliberately keeping the answers from her. The story felt too important, too painful to just remain lost. But that's exactly what it seemed to be, a piece of history buried and forgotten. Sarah couldn't accept that she needed to know what happened to Margaret. She couldn't shake the image of the woman who had been left alone after losing her husband, who had to live with that grief every day of her life, with no closure and no way to move on. Sarah found herself driving to a small town she'd found listed as Margaret's last known residence. But when she arrived at the address, the house was empty, the windows boarded up, the lawn overgrown with weeds. It looked abandoned, but something about it felt too familiar, like Sarah was standing in the middle of a memory, one that hadn't yet been fully told. She knocked on the door anyway, hoping against hope that someone might answer, maybe a neighbor, someone who knew Margaret's story. The door creaked open slowly, and a frail woman stood in the doorway, her face lined with age, but her eyes sharp with something that felt like recognition. Sarah introduced herself and explained the reason for her visit. The woman's eyes flickered for a brief moment, then softened as she stepped aside, allowing Sarah to enter the dimly lit house. The air inside was heavy with dust and the smell of old wood, but there was something comforting about the quiet, as if the house had been waiting for someone to step through its door. Sarah showed the woman the ring, the gold gleaming in her palm, and the woman's expression changed. Instantly her eyes widened, her hand shaking as she reached out to touch the ring. She didn't say anything at first, but her lips trembled like she was holding back a flood of emotion. Sarah could feel the tension building in the room, the air thick with something unspoken, as the woman stared at the ring, recognition dawning on her face. The woman's hand trembled as she touched the ring, her fingers brushing against the cool metal like she was afraid to acknowledge what it was, but Sarah could see the recognition in her eyes. This wasn't just any woman, this was someone who knew the story, the untold story that Sarah had been searching for her entire life. The woman's lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, she slowly withdrew her hand and stepped back as if the ring was too much to bear. Sarah held her breath, waiting for something, anything that could break the silence. The weight of the moment was unbearable as the woman finally spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "It's Margaret's ring." She said the words hanging in the air like a forgotten memory. Finally dragged into the light, "Margaret was my sister." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. This was it. She had finally found a connection. After all the hours of searching the dead, ends the frustration. It had all led to this moment. She swallowed hard and took a step closer. What happened to her? She asked, her voice trembling with the weight of the question. The woman closed her eyes as if the memory of her sister was too painful to face. She sighed deeply and then began to speak. Margaret was never the same after William died. She said he was the love of her life. They had been married only a few years. Before that flight, their dream was to see the world together, to live a life full of adventure. But when the plane went down, Margaret never recovered. She lost more than just her husband. She lost her future, her hope, her will to live. She became a shadow of the woman she once was. Sarah could feel the pain in the woman's words, as if the grief had never left her sister. And now it was being passed on to her. The woman's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Margaret never wore the ring again after that day. She never spoke of it. She said it was a reminder of a life that was stolen from her. But Margaret never gave up hope. She believed that somehow one day she would find a way to be whole again, and maybe even find peace. Sarah listened intently, trying to hold on to every word. As the woman continued, Margaret believed that somehow the world would give her something back, that it would return what she had lost after all those years of loneliness and sorrow. She believed it was possible, that someday someone would find the ring and bring it back to her. Sarah could feel the weight of the woman's words settle deep in her chest. It was as if the ring wasn't just a symbol of loss. It was also a symbol of hope, of a love that had never truly faded. She had found it. But now she had to figure out how to give it back to Margaret, how to find a woman who had disappeared into the fog of time. The woman stopped speaking and looked down at the ring. A long silence hung between them. Sarah's mind was racing. She knew she was so close to the truth. She could feel it. But something still didn't make sense. Why had Margaret never returned to claim the ring? Why had it been left to gather dust all these years? Why had Sarah found it now? Why had fate chosen her to carry out this task? The answers felt just beyond her reach, like a story that had been written, but was missing the final chapter. Sarah stood there holding the ring in her palm. As the woman's words echoed in her mind, the weight of the loss, the years of silence and unspoken grief, it felt like the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for Sarah to make the next move. She could feel the gravity of the situation, pulling her deeper into something far bigger than herself. Margaret's story was no longer just about a ring. It was about a life interrupted, a love lost, and a chance for closure that had slipped away into the shadows of time. Sarah's fingers tightened around the ring. She had to return it to Margaret. But where was she? How could she find a woman who had vanished into the past? How could she bring peace to someone who had been lost for so long? She asked the woman who had once been Margaret's sister what happened to her. After that day, where did she go? The woman's gaze grew distant, her mind retreating into memories that seemed to haunt her. But she eventually spoke with a heavy sigh. Margaret couldn't stay here anymore. After William's death, she said she left everything behind, her home, her friends, even me. We never heard from her again. She couldn't bear the memories of him. She was consumed by the loss and couldn't face it anymore. Sarah felt a deep pang in her chest. As the woman continued, it's like she disappeared into thin air. No one ever saw her again. The mystery was like a void that nobody could fill. Sarah's heart ached for Margaret's pain. But there was something else now, a burning question that wouldn't let her go. What about the ring? Why was it left behind? If Margaret had truly disappeared, why had she never come back to claim it? The woman paused and looked at Sarah, like she was finally seeing the full weight of what had been lost. It wasn't just the ring, she said. It was a piece of her hope that died when she lost William. The ring had been a symbol of their love, but after the crash, it became a reminder of the life that would never be. Sarah felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The idea that Margaret had left so much behind, including the ring. It didn't sit right with her. She wasn't sure why. But she knew she had to find out where Margaret had gone, how she could disappear without a trace. It was as if the world had swallowed her whole, and now all Sarah had were whispers of a memory. She could barely hold on to. Sarah left the house with more questions than answers. Her mind was spinning, trying to piece together what she had learned. But one thing was clear, she couldn't stop now. She had to find Margaret. She had to return the ring and give it back to the woman who had lost everything she loved. As she drove back to her apartment, the weight of the ring in her pocket seemed heavier than ever before. It was like it was calling her, telling her to keep searching, to not give up no matter how impossible It seemed the ring had been meant for Margaret, but Sarah didn't know how to find her. All she knew was that the mystery wasn't over yet. And she couldn't let it rest. She had to know where Margaret went, why she vanished into thin air, and what had happened to the woman who had lost so much after all these years. Sarah felt a new fire igniting within her. She wasn't just chasing a lost piece of jewelry, she was chasing a life, a story that had yet to be told. And she couldn't stop until she had all the answers, no matter how far she had to go to find them. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was getting closer to something she wasn't ready for. The more she dug into Margaret's past, the more it seemed like the story wasn't just about loss, it was about a life that had been hidden away, a secret too painful to share. Sarah spent days tracing every lead, trying to find anyone who might know where Margaret had gone. But each path she followed ended in silence. It was as if the woman had erased herself for existence, like she had decided to disappear forever and take her memories with her. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by old papers, photographs, and the notes she had taken, but none of it made sense. She kept coming back to the same question. Why hadn't Margaret ever come back for the ring? Why had she left it behind? If it meant so much to her, Sarah couldn't find an answer, and it was driving her crazy. She had to know what had happened to Margaret, why she had vanished, why she had given up on everything she had ever known. She stared at the ring again, turning it over in her fingers, the light from the window catching the engraving. It felt like a key to a locked door, a door that she couldn't open no matter how hard she tried. But then something clicked in her mind, a memory of a name she had heard long ago, one that had been buried in the fog of the past. It was the name of a lawyer, a man who had been involved in the settlement of William James's estate. After the crash, she quickly gathered her things and headed out the door, driving to the lawyer's office with the ring in her pocket. Her heart was racing faster than her thoughts. The closer she got, the more she felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. When she arrived, she wasn't sure what to expect. Would he have any answers? Or would he turn her away like everyone else she didn't know? But she had to try. She walked into the office, her footsteps echoing in the cold marble lobby. The receptionist directed her to a small room at the back, and before she knew it, she was face to face with the lawyer, a man in his late 50s, his grey hair and sharp eyes giving away the years of experience he had in his field. He didn't look surprised to see her, but there was something unreadable in his expression as he glanced down at the ring Sarah had placed on the table. His eyes flickered briefly. Then he looked up at her. "I didn't think anyone would ever come looking for that," he said, his voice flat and tired. Sarah felt a jolt of adrenaline. "Why, what do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The lawyer leaned back in his chair and sighed. "I was the one who handled Margaret's affairs after William died," he said. "She disappeared not long after the crash, but she left instructions with me to sell her house and move the money into an account for her for when she was ready to come back. But she never did. No one ever heard from her again. And the account just sat there untouched all these years." Sarah's pulse quickened as she took in his words. "What do you mean, untouched?" she asked, her mind spinning. The lawyer's face softened. "She left everything behind. Every part of her life was put into storage. She never spent a cent of the money. She had the house, the car, the savings. It was like she just walked away from everything." Sarah was speechless. She felt as though the ground beneath her was shifting. Margaret had planned to come back, but she never did. She had planned to return, but something had stopped her. Something had made her vanish without a trace. And now Sarah was holding the last piece of the puzzle, the ring, the symbol of a love that had been lost forever. Sarah felt a cold shiver run down her spine as the lawyer's words sank in. Untouched. It was like Margaret had been waiting for something to bring her back, waiting for some kind of sign. But she never came back. Sarah's hands were shaking as she looked at the ring in her palm, the very symbol of a love story that had been lost forever. But as the lawyer continued speaking, a new realization began to dawn on her. There was more to this than just a forgotten piece of jewelry. There was something deeper, something that had kept Margaret away, Something had stopped her from ever coming back for the life she had left behind. Sarah felt her heart racing as she pressed him further. What happened to her? Why did she leave everything behind? She asked. The lawyer looked at her, his face softening, as if he had been waiting for someone to ask the question for years. Margaret never got over the loss of William, he said quietly. She blamed herself for what happened that day in the crash. She never thought she deserved to have anything good again. She felt like she had been given a second chance at life. But it wasn't a life she wanted. Sarah could hear the pain in his voice. She was consumed with guilt for something that wasn't even her fault. She couldn't face the world after losing him, so she disappeared to live a life of solitude, somewhere where she wouldn't have to be reminded of the love she had lost. Sarah's chest tightened. She understood now why Margaret had never returned for the ring, why she had never come back for the life she had once known. It wasn't that she didn't want to, it was that she couldn't bring herself to face it. The memories, the pain, the guilt that had eaten away at her every day. Margaret had never stopped loving William, but the weight of losing him was something she couldn't bear. She had chosen to disappear, to fade into the shadows, rather than carry on with a life that had lost its meaning. But there was something else, something that Sarah couldn't ignore. Margaret had left a trail for someone to find the ring. She had left it for a reason. Sarah looked at the lawyer in disbelief. Are you saying that Margaret wanted someone to find her? She asked. He nodded slowly. She may not have been able to return to the life she had, but she wanted the ring to find its way back to her, so that she could finally let go of the past. Sarah felt her eyes fill with tears as the weight of it all hit her. Margaret had been waiting for closure, waiting for the moment when the ring would return to her and give her the chance to say goodbye to William, to the love she had lost, to the life that had been stolen from her. And now Sarah was the one who had the final piece of the puzzle. The ring was the bridge between the past and the present. It was the key to setting Margaret's soul free. Sarah knew what she had to do. She couldn't keep the ring anymore. She couldn't carry this burden alone. She had to find Margaret and return it to her. She had to help her find the peace she had been searching for all these years. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was the right thing to do. And as Sarah walked out of the lawyer's office with the ring in her pocket, she felt the weight of her journey lift for the first time in weeks. She was finally ready to face whatever came next. No matter how difficult it might be, she had a purpose. And that purpose was to return the ring and give Margaret back the one thing that had been lost for so long.